For tuning into another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. Um, Now, I want to reach back to the very early days of the vlog. It would have been spring 2021 when I was doing videos about public transport needs. I was doing two videos. One about how to improve public transport in auto-oriented cities that are fast-growing, things like Los Angeles. It was the main star of the video, but it was talking about examples from Calgary. Calgary having a not terrible transit model split. I mean, they're maybe, I think even of Corona, they were maybe 15, 16%. Um, and metro area. I mean, just, they say metro area, not city, but I think in Calgary they're basically the same. And then I did the one about slow growing cities. So that would be, I think the star of that was Cleveland, where and I'm not going to preview, and I'm going to review these videos. You can just go and look for them. But uh, but it's, I think, useful to add issues related to public transport in cities that are not auto oriented. By which I mean cities that already have strong public transit networks. So this would be things like New York, Berlin, of course, Paris, London, Tokyo, Singapore. Um, I'm not going to go into Tel Aviv just because Tel Aviv doesn't even have a subway yet, or if it does, it literally just opened. I think it hasn't opened yet. Nobody expects it to open. And I'm also not going to talk about things involving small cities. That might be another video. Things like Stockholm, Prague, so cities that have strong model split but are small because there are different issues there. So in a large city, so first of all, why do we care? I mean, if the point is maybe to effect model split, maybe New York is good enough and you should just worry about LA and Cleveland, right? Well, here's the thing. So in the United States, about 40% of people who commute to work by public transportation live in Metro New York. And then the secondary transit cities, by which I mean Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco. These are about another 20 or 25%. We're gonna maybe not mention Seattle, which I think actually overtook Philadelphia's model split, but it's kind of, because it's a smaller city and it's growing, it has somewhat different dynamics. And Honolulu, which is just as small. Honolulu is, I think, 8 or 9%, so about the same as Philly. And likewise in France. In France, about half of people who commute by public transport live in Ile-de-France. The model split in Ile-de-France is 43%. The model split in France is 16%. Ile-de-France is about 20% of metropolitan France's population. So you do 43 times 0.2, and yeah, it's about half of 16. And I don't know, I imagine the same would be true in London. I haven't seen the exact numbers in London in a while, but the UK, sorry, England and Wales, because I haven't seen numbers for Scotland, England and Wales have the same public transport commuter model split as France, or for that matter Germany. It's 16%. This is all pre-corona numbers. This is 2011 in England and Wales. I don't remember the numbers for London because there's no easily defined London region. There's in contrast there. So Greater London is comparable to Paris and its inner suburbs, the Petite Couronne. The equivalent of the entirety of Ile-de-France is London in some of southeast England, but not all of southeast England. So what counts as a suburb? It is not as clear. Maybe you do southeast, but without Oxfordshire, but then you add Essex or something. And so it's probably also about the same. Probably about half of people who commute by bus or train in Britain live in and around London. And so these are very important for the existing system. Of course, Berlin is a smaller share of Germany, so that does not exist in that calculation. In Berlin would give you a much smaller number. Germany is again 16%. Berlin is about 40, but that's Berlin without suburbs. Berlin with suburbs is probably low 30s. And of course, it's a much smaller share of Germany. And but also they're important for the future. And this is something that I'm going to motivate in a bit, which is that certainly in the United States, you can kind of figure out from cities where they have, let's call it, missing public transport ridership. So in Los Angeles, you can figure out corridors where if the region were capable of building and running trains, it is capable of doing 0 out of 2. But if the United States could build, then LA would be adding more lines. And if LA were capable of adding more lines and adding them at the right place, a lot more people would ride the trains in LA eventually. So LA does have a system that kind of gets you from downtown LA to the corners of the county, most of them at least. Just it's not dense enough. I don't mean LA is not dense enough. I mean its network is not dense enough. So nobody depends on it. So jobs don't locate based on it. And that's a vicious cycle. But eventually you can break it by building enough. And the enough is something that would be within its budgetary capacity at normal construction costs. And then LA would have higher ridership. It would not have the per capita ridership of Tokyo. It would not be Singapore. It would not be Tokyo. It would be more than it is today. And the thing is, if you assume that people can build, and if you assume that they can run trains better, New York can build as well and get even more ridership. And create even more space for people to move in. Now, the New York region is very NIMBY, but that's on the New York side. On the Jersey side, they don't build a lot of housing, but they build housing in more than infinitesimal quantities, let's call it. And the same is true in Paris. So Paris is actually, so I need to talk about Paris because Paris, we're talking about why it's important, but then we're going to talk about what they're actually doing. And talking about New York and London is kind of difficult because New York absolutely can't build. LA, as of recently, can't build either. It really wants to. New York doesn't really want to build. They're fine with being run by incompetence. LA actually also can't build, but unlike New York, wants to build. And finds it embarrassing that it can't. London also, I think, wants to build but can't. So in Paris, they were building 200 kilometers worth of Grand Paris Express. And there's a lot of missing ridership, even in Ile-de-France. So I don't know to what extent Anne Hidalgo cares about this, because Anne Hidalgo doesn't really care beyond the boundary of the city. But if you ask transit advocates in Paris, is public transport in Paris good enough? Of course they're going to say no. The riders say no. People in Paris hate the trains. Especially they hate the commuter trains. They hate the RER. They think the metro is better. Now, maybe going on, maybe from an outside perspective, we can say that the Parisian transport system, and I'm going to actually pull up a map because I don't want to just talk in front of a low-resolution Google Earth, and see whether there's something that we can use in this, and if not, we're going to. So this is the more inner parts of the system. So thick lines are the commuter trains in and around Paris. The thinner lines, like this, are the metro lines. And I guess the busiest metro line is this one. It's Metro 1. It's not very visible on this map. Also because the RER mostly duplicates it. It's hard to see here, but this is a metro line. This is the busiest metro line in the city. And so this too has a lot of missing ridership. Again, maybe people in the city ride the metro happily, but certainly nobody in the region rides the RER happily. And again, from an outside perspective, we can say that the existence of the RER was a major innovation for post-war Paris, because they could not have extended the metro into the suburbs very easily. They have done some suburban extensions, but they can't go too deep because the trains are too slow. The distances between the stations are too short. So they built. I won't say they built these lines. Most of these were pre-existing lines that they just built long tunnels connecting. So this was a pre-existing line, so they built this tunnel. I think this is the tunnel that they built. This pre-existed. This existed, so they essentially built this tunnel and are now extending it this way to things that pre-exist going from La Défense to the west. Here and here they built a tunnel. This pre-existed. On the sea, I think they only built this section. So the really weird, whatever you'd call this kind of alignment. It's kind of designed to miss every important destination. This is why it's the weakest line. Most of this pre-exists just this section. So, so the point is that so in Paris, the reason they have such high public transport ridership, yeah, the metro is really useful, but I mean, New York has the metro too. Ile-de-France has 43% model split. New York is about 30. So, or Metro New York about 30. So, on hindsight, we could say, yeah, they've built this, but people aren't happy riding this, so they're investing in making it better, like doing this extension. They're doing a lot of operational improvements. They're trying to build a lot of suburb-to-suburb transit, that is Grand Paris Express. There is a lot of missing ridership. Again, the advocates in Paris don't think that the system is good enough. They think that it needs to be improved. They're right. From what I've heard of what the advocates want, they're actually have pretty well-grounded ideas of what investments are good and what are not good. And the same is true of, let's say, a London, a Berlin, a Tokyo, but in Tokyo I'm less familiar with the advocacy space, where there's always more stuff that can be built. These are not places with 100% model splits. They're not places with extremely convenient options. The trains are generally very crowded. And of course in Tokyo they are very legendarily crowded, but there's a lot of overcrowding in London. There's some overcrowding in Paris, I believe less so than in London. The metro is kind of remarkable in not at all having that kind of London-style overcrowding where you have 5 people standing per square meter. The does not have that failure mode, but sometimes when the trains get delayed, that does happen. And Berlin does not have it anywhere near Berlin. I mean, I'm talking about very large cities right now, and this is why I'm talking about issues that are things like London, Paris, maybe New York. Even Berlin is not necessarily large. We're going to talk about it a bit, but it's not. But the needs there, it's kind of intermediate between the needs of the Parises and the Londons and the needs of the Stockholms, the Viennas, the Pragues. And so there's still a lot of need. This also means there's a lot of missing ridership. Paris specifically also builds decent amounts of housing. Not the city, of course, but the inner suburbs. And this is mostly transit-oriented development. They build where the trains are or where the trains are going to be. And this means that they're trying to grow the region in tandem with the public transport system. So nearly all of these big transit cities are also very wealthy and attract a lot of potential domestic and international migrants. New York, very wealthy. London, Paris. Berlin's the main exception, but Berlin too is increasingly attracting people. Again, Munich is probably too small for us to talk about it very extensively. But something, again, also the smaller transit cities often do. Again, the Munichs, Prague, of course, Stockholm. And so a lot of this is about managing the city's own growth. Why does the city need to manage its own growth? Because it is growing. Even very NIMBY places, London is considerably NIMBYer than Paris. NIMBY places are growing as well. They also need to be less NIMBY, but they're growing. And this is something that has to be publicly managed. This is something that I have to constantly explain to certain public transport advocates who talk about issues of subsidy and how transit #well actually requires less government subsidy than roads. That is all correct. It does, however, require more government coordination than roads. So the London Underground before Corona was breaking even financially. So was the Berlin U-Bahn. I don't know the finances in Paris at that granular level. The region overall, the public transport there was 40% fare box recovery. So for every euro in expenditure, about 40 cents came from fares. In Berlin, the corresponding figure was 67 cents. I think maybe 65 or 66, actually, not 67, but thereabouts. Um, so usually the way it works is that the city subway does much better because it doesn't have very long low ridership tails. I guess the London Underground actually does have long low ridership tails in West London, but also it charges very high fares. The Paris Metro, I'm certain, even today remains profitable. It's just that the fares are in integration with very financially weak buses and with very heavily subsidized commuter trains. The suburbs get subsidized. So again, this is something that can be done with heavy subsidies, like in Paris. But even when it doesn't, but even when the subsidies are lighter, like in Berlin, or when they are absent, as in Tokyo, there's still a lot of coordination that's required about where the lines go. Public transit is not a consumer good. In fact, one of the hallmarks of public transit, one of the things that make public transit work, is that it's more efficient. Less money, fewer resources are being spent on private consumption. In the United States, that's a kind of corner case of extraordinarily auto-oriented society. Household spending across all categories, I've seen different numbers on this, but something like 18% of American consumer spending is on transportation, which means cars. Again, this is a country where public transport, the model split for that is 5%, active also very low. So, and these are also cheaper. So 18% of household spending in an auto-oriented society is something that is required for buying the car, maintaining the car, paying the cost of fuel. That's a lot of money, and this is something that, I mean, is just much lower in places that have even semi-decent public transit in cities where people can rely on the subway. The numbers are not going to be 18%; they're going to be low to mid-single digit, 4 or 5%. It saves that much money, so it's very efficient. And I think what breaks a lot of people's brain is that it's efficient, but it's also something that, because of issues of scale, will never work at the level of private competition. Yeah, there was a time in which it did. That time, I think, was last in the early 20th century, when a bunch of private operators were building lines in London. And even then, the most financially successful part of the early London Underground was a pre-planned 3-line system by Charles Yerkes. They essentially bought franchises to build and operate 3 lines: the Piccadilly, the Bakerloo, and the Charing Cross half of what is now the Northern Line. So even then, there were emergent returns to scale. So this is something that has to be coordinated top down. It's just very efficient. On net, households will be spending less on this, but it also means that you do not spend as much on consumer goods, and therefore it's something that does involve non-market mechanisms. Hence the need for coordination. This is a capital good, not a consumer good. But that also means that figuring out where the growth is going to happen, making sure that the lines are built where they're building new housing or where there's already high housing density, and vice versa. These are important planning concerns. So first of all, so you have the issue of managing the city's own growth. And again, all of these example cities are growing, and this is even true of the one place that is notably not very wealthy compared with the country that it's in, which is Berlin. Berlin maybe now finally overtook the average German per capita income, but if so, it was very recent, and it may not have even done so yet. Again, this is not Munich. Munich is filthy rich. Those Bavarians. These Bavarians. Munich is even richer than the rest of Bavaria. Berlin is not. Berlin is, half of Berlin is an East German city. And And even Berlin is growing. The housing construction rate here is something like, I think 17 or 18,000 units. I think it's 18,000 units a year, so it's about 5 per 1,000 people per year. And that's clearly not enough. Prices are rising. And so here too, there's the issue of managing the city's own growth. I don't think the city's not. I do not think the city's doing a very good job at it, but this is a need. And so some of the investment is about that. Figuring out. So in Berlin, we'll be figuring out growth areas, and this is where the outgoing. I shouldn't say outgoing because the previous administration was already prioritizing things like extending U7 to the airport, because we're trying to do a lot of. So the U-Bahn ends here at Rudo. The airport is served by many mainline trains, so commuter trains on the S-Bahn. Separately, mainline trains that are not S-Bahn, like the Airport Express, FAX, and a few regional and intercities that serve it from multiple directions. But the U-Bahn ends at Rudo, so their plans, I think that's actually the most advanced of the current slate of U-Bahn expansion proposals, to go from Rudo all the way here to the airport. As you can see, this is not a very well developed area, and yeah, of course you can't develop the middle of the runways, but you can develop this. And so the plan has been to work with to redevelop parts here in the outer margin of the city, work with Schönefeld on developing this area as a growth region. The other thing, the thing that they should be doing, but they're not, but the previous administrations didn't do. I have no idea what the current one is going to do. They certainly promised to do it, but these are people who overpromise. Is to extend the other end, the other line, U8, to go into Märkisches Viertel, where you can visibly see it's a pretty dense housing project. And it's just past the northern end of the U-Bahn. So this should be a thing. So this is less about managing future growth and more about fulfilling a promise from 50 years ago. And to dwell on this a bit, so one of the needs is every transit city has gaps. You want to fill the gaps. Now, this is something that is different in large and small cities. So in large cities, and in this case Berlin is a large city, one of the needs is to fill in a few gaps. Now, in a small city is going to have many more gaps because it's not going to have as many lines. So there's many more gaps in between, and you can't prioritize all of them. But in a large one, it's very likely that you only have a handful, Märkisches Viertel being the main one in Berlin. So this is one of the needs in a city like Berlin, or in a city like New York. Actually, in the United States, there's an ongoing thing about Washington Metro alignments. You could build. Yes, okay. Borners, 1930s Japan was not an especially wealthy country, and by the post-war era, this needed government coordination. With both the Tokyo Metro and then the and the Toei lines and the coordination of through running. This was not a purely private thing, the way that in the United Kingdom it was expected in the 1860s that there should be private capital doing. I can't even tell if they were even planning full through running or just the connection between Euston and Charing Cross, aka what became the Charing Cross half of the Northern Line. I mean, they also couldn't get funding, but it was expected that they should. So it's actually something that's relevant to a city that's not as big and not as transit-oriented, but exists, is Washington. So in Washington, let me see if I can find the Washington Metro expansion. expansion because this is something that has just been announced. There. Okay, let's see if I can do this without getting to without paywall. So, nope, I'm getting paywalled. So they have a bunch of these alternatives for how to manage the city's own growth, and again, look at places that needed to be look at gaps in the system. So Washington being a much smaller city will have more gaps. Of course, it's a much less dense city, so it's less like the very dense gaps. Let me see if I can actually find these maps. We want to look at something called Alternative 4, which is probably what they want to build. It's also incredibly expensive. I just want to see maps. I can explain. Okay. I think this is what they want to do. So the point is that, and actually DC, despite not being a very large city, is really emblematic of the needs in a transit-oriented city. So let's dwell on that for a moment. So, as I said, you want to manage the city's own growth. DC is growing pretty healthily. I don't remember the construction rates in the city, in the district. We can check this. But the suburbs are actually building pretty healthily. It's usually very sprawly. Washington does not actually do that much transit-oriented development. Yeah, District of Columbia, state total, and let's try to do annual. Since 2010. This is on a population of what, 700,000 maybe? So this is pretty healthy housing growth. Maybe no, well, not in 2010, but so Washington D.C. What was the population in the early 2010s? So now, okay, so just short of 700. Okay, so this would have been on the order, or what, just short of 700. So this would be on the order of maybe 6-ish per, or 7-ish per 1,000 people, and last year was maybe 11, and this is very good. So DC is building housing, practically all in large multifamily, not single family. Again, the suburbs are much more single family oriented, and even the multifamily is often rather sprawly. So there's managing the city's own growth. So you want to build into new growth zones. The problem is there aren't really good growth zones for new lines in DC, as I understand it. Then you want to fill in gaps in the system. Often these involve past promises, but these can also come from things that were not thought of as important at the time. And this is something that is very prominent in the idea of the separated blue line. So the system as currently exists has 6 lines identifiable by color. On this map, 5 of them are as is. I don't actually remember if the yellow line goes here or here today. The yellow and blue share this trunk. There's reverse branching, which wrecks system capacity because 3 lines, 2 lines. Yellow does, again, I forget whether this or this. Blue does the thing that the yellow doesn't do, and then it goes like this. And then from Ross, and then it hits Rosslyn, and then here it shares tracks with orange and silver. Nowadays it, I think, goes to Largo, but they keep moving around the eastern terminals. And so the investment need. So the reason that they do the separated blue line, where, to be clear, the most crowded of the 3 lines on this trunk is the orange. Is so you want to, so as I said, you want to fill in, you want to manage growth, you want to fill in gaps. And in Washington, the gap that people talk about the most is Georgetown. Georgetown did not get, so when they were building, so in retrospect, everyone understands that when they built the original system, they should have made the tunnel from which is currently the blue and orange line, so the one that gets to Foggy Bottom, instead of going direct from city center to Arlington, they should have detoured a bit via Georgetown and done this. They didn't do so. And the reason they didn't do so is that they were thinking about building a very commuter-oriented system. The Washington Metro is a suburban metro. It's essentially trying to imitate commuter rail without the commuter rail legacy, without the legacy rail aspects of it. And if you think that this is a bad thing, in DC, I don't think it was bad. They didn't have enough of a legacy commuter rail system to leverage. Chinese cities, same thing. So they built suburban metros. Stockholm was built a suburban metro and has a very large model split. A lot of it depends on the quality of transit-oriented development, where the quality is what's gonna make the system work. In DC, the quality is better than in the rest of the United States. All of this density that you can see here on Google Earth is TOD since the 70s, since Metro was built. There's just not enough of it. In Stockholm, they did in Vancouver, they did better than in DC. In Stockholm, they did better than in Vancouver. So anyway, it's understood nowadays that they should have gone via Georgetown, but they were thinking in terms of commuters. But they were thinking in terms of commuters to city center. City center, the peak job density is just north of the White House, around Farragut, plus more shopping, entertainment things east of the White House, Metro Center. So they were trying to get to this region first and foremost. And there just were not enough commuters here. Nowadays, we are much more informed about what transit is for, so we know much more about the patterns of non-commute trips. We know about things like student trips. So the university is nowadays understood to be a very big ridership generator. So this means that there should be a stop in close to campus, but also close to the neighborhood center, which is a little bit of attention because the campus is here and the neighborhood center is this intersection. It's also understood that there's job sprawl of various kinds, so it can just go into suburban, very auto-oriented places, like Tyson's here. It can go into non-places where these are called edgeless cities. This is called an edge city. So an edgeless city is just this, but in much smaller scales. Tyson's did in fact get a Silver Line extension. It was the only part of the Silver Line that is any good. The Silver Line, unfortunately, because it created this 3-line interlining, while parts of it, namely the Blue Line, are part of a 2-line interlining that broke the system in a lot of ways. So nowadays it's understood that they should have built here just because these neighborhood centers generate ridership, even if it's not visible in commutes. They also generate their own commuters nowadays. Universities are big employment centers. They attract more employment that maybe wants to recruit from the university. And then the employment cluster may be independent of the university. Not everywhere. I don't think Georgetown has that much of it. Neither does Morningside Heights, so that's Columbia. Kendall Square, so MIT, has a lot of it. Westwood, that's LA, same thing. Westwood, it actually is the either second or third largest employment cluster in LA County. Downtown LA is the first, and I don't remember what is bigger, Century City or Westwood, but it's that big. So much bigger UCLA. So nowadays it's understood that they should have built here, but so the plans involve detouring through here for the separated line. And so we're talking. So what did I say? I said managing growth, filling in gaps, and now there's the issue of capacity. A transit city will generally have a lot of crowded trains. Even a city that there's not as much of a transit city will have that. This depends on model split, but also on size. DC does not have a lot of model splits. I think pre-corona was metro area wide maybe 12 or 13%. But the way it works is that people who work in city center tend to have very high model splits. And so even with not a very healthy ridership, you can still get a lot of tidal demand at the peak. So one of the needs in a transit city, and this is much more so in a place like New York or London than in DC, is to decongest the peak, is to do a lot of relief. Most of the Tokyo subway system, a significant amount does run on commuter rail rights of way, yes, like both branches of the Red Line, but they did not have any through city things and any through city rights of way that worked, because the only legacy alignment through the city is this one, which is okay if you're trying to get to Congress and not okay if you're trying to go anywhere else. This is not, remember that this was already city center. This is not, like, they could not have moved city center here to build an RER type system. No, they needed service here. They did a lot of stupid things. This was not a stupid thing. Favoring serving this part of the city over serving this part. I mean, they did serve L'Enfant on the trains. It's just this needed service. So the point is that you have tidal demands at the peak. So one of the needs is to decongest the peak. So in DC, they're trying to do a separated blue line as a way of doing 2 for 3. It's not about managing growth, but it is about filling in a gap and also decongesting the peak, and then also doing other things that with these plans that don't work as well, like the weird loop where they're planning to spend a lot of money on trains here where there's not going to be a lot of demand for them. And again, they just also generally can't build because their construction costs are insane. But the idea of the separated blue line is not by itself stupid. You just need to workshop it to be better. And so decongestion can come in a bunch of ways. So you can build next to the very congested line. This is what DC is doing. You can try to build on other corridors to absorb some of the demand. And now Paris is doing the latter, and Paris has better planning than DC, but it doesn't mean that what Paris is doing is superior to what DC is doing. Each strategy has its own pros and cons. And it's very place specific. In Paris, the issue is that there's so much. So in Paris, the issue is that they need better suburb to suburb public transit. In general, public transit is used much more by people commuting to city center than by people commuting anywhere else. In Paris, a large majority of trips to or from the city, so between the suburbs and the city, are done by public transport. Trips between the suburbs are much more often done by car. Now, Paris is a very strongly centered city, no matter what people who count skyscrapers will tell you. The city is, I think, the city is about 33% of metro area jobs, which is a lot for its geographical extent. But there's still, 2/3, it's not that, of which the most prominent is La Défense. So they're trying to build suburban transit directly from, for example, the northern suburbs, which is the poorest in the region, direct to La Défense. Whereas today, what they do is they take the train and change. Now, I don't know the numbers, but I can guarantee you that trips like this are done by train rather than people driving, because first of all, the trains. The transfer at Le Halles is annoying, but it's RER to RER, it's not that bad. And the second thing is that the people here can't afford cars. They want to afford cars. It's actually a thing where a lot of it is working class aspiration to own a car, because that's how you prove you're not poor, by splurging on consumer goods. But it's a consumer good, it's a splurge. They can't afford it often, so they do depend on the system. which is so for very long-term planning. You want to grow the model split through converting drivers to transit riders. You also want new arrivals to stay on transit, but also you want people within the city, within the region, who are on public transit to stay on public transit. If they're on the system because they're poor, you want to make the system good enough that they voluntarily choose to to stay on it as they get wealthier. If you don't do that, you will just have a gradual adverse model split, aka every American city between the 1950s and the present, really. Um, and and so in Paris, what they're doing is they're building Grand Paris Express, not to even touch the city. It's some expansions of existing lines to the city and into the suburbs. That's M14. It's going to be extended north and south. It's the most recent metro line, and therefore it is the one with higher average speed, more longer interstations. But they're also building a bunch of orbitals. So they're building this orbital that is just outside the city limits, hitting places. Of course, the most important is La Défense, and then Saint Denis, things like that. Stade de France. So I'm forgetting the exact alignment, something like this maybe. And then they're building maybe an outer semi-ring for M16, and they're doing some god-awful airport connection on M17 because, and I mean, they're building it well in the sense that this M17 line is going to go through this unbuilt area, so that's going to turn into a TOD zone, the Triangle of Gonesse, this area. It's just a bad line. They don't need more airport travel. And then, or a bit more airport transit, there's enough. And then M18 is connecting suburbs here to here, and it's another kind of outer ring that is not terribly useful. It's there mostly to convince wealthy people who mostly drive in this part of the region that they're getting investment too. But M14 and M15, M16 are very good, and it's good that they're doing that. And so the point is that they are trying to create more capacity by building more direct lines, so that people don't need people don't need to do things like the tidal run of people in the from the suburbs to the city at Russia, because they can just go direct here. And this also gets me to a fourth need. So we're talking about managing growth. We're talking about filling in gaps. I don't actually know if Paris has significant gaps. We're talking about, I mean, there's a perceived gap, which is rich people hate taking the RER because the RER has working class Black and Arab riders. So people keep saying that the airport transit is not good, even though objectively the trains from Charles de Gaulle to the city, there's off-peak, a train every 15 minutes that makes all the intermediate stops, a train every 15 minutes that makes no intermediate stops. At rush hour, the throughput is too high to have local and express trains on two tracks. So all the trains run local, and they're on every 6 minutes. It's very good service. People should stop whining. But they're building an express option for very wealthy people called the Charles de Gaulle Express, and then they're planning on M17. So that's a perceived gap, but it's not an actual gap. And then you want to resolve bottlenecks. Yeah, exactly. Isn't it kind of low off-peak frequency for urban rail? Sure, but look at the distance. This is not urban rail going to the airport. Now, it's not on a tact. Actually, maybe it is on a tact, and I just never memorized the tact, because the trains from Paris to Biel-Silivet were not tact, and I memorized the tact while commuting out to EHS when I was doing that in late 2016. And maybe this is on a talk that could have been memorized and I just did not do so. The but the distance is enough that you're spending much more time on the train than waiting for the train. I think it's maybe a half-hour trip one way. Now, France does not have the most adept digital governance, so let's see if we're gonna get that. Well, Gare du Départ, Châtelet-Les Halles, and we want airport, let's say this one. Okay, why are you not telling me when the line arrives? So this is the slow train, I guess. And then this would be, okay, maybe there's a service change. Okay, you're not telling me how long the trip is, which bothers me greatly. Yeah, I did warn you guys it was gonna happen. Au départ, let's do the trains to the city just because it's much easier. Oh my god. I just want a fiche horaire. Yeah, fiche horaire. And I certainly do not want... Oh, it's TGV is where they're doing this to me. Yeah, I believe it's a half-hour one-way trip. No, I mean, yeah, Berlin. Yeah, Berlin is annoying in that there are a bunch of patterns that are every half hour, and they are not. Berlin has too many places in the city that have their own trains to the airport. So I think from where I live, so from Ostbahnhof, it is 4 trains an hour with alternating 10 and 20-minute gaps. Every other train is direct. Every other train requires changing at Ostkreuz. And this is, I think, a 25-minute in-vehicle trip. Horaire du 18, direction, let's say city to airport. Yeah, they did actually give me what I wanted eventually. I emphasize eventually. So airport is here. They just not have the express trains anymore. Oh, yeah, they do. So the express trains do it. Oh, and finally they made the express trains not super express, but stop at Orléans. Thank you. This is okay. Half an hour from Gare du Nord to the airport. Yeah, I mean 15 minutes is not the best, but it's okay. And remember that it's not 15 minutes; it's 2 trains. That each of them comes every 15 minutes. So you have you have gaps of, I guess, 11 minutes in arrival times at the airport, which is not the best, but it's also not the worst. Yes, it's not that the first stop is only 26 minutes away. This is because these are express trains. They're designed for express travel to the airport. They stop at Aulnay is nice, but Aulnay is the branch point between Mitry-Claye and the airport. Aulnay has a ton of frequency on the local trains. So anyway, the point is that this is not a gap, and then there's capacity management we're to do, and then so these 3 things, and then the 4th thing would be adding more service. Not exactly gaps, because think of it not as service to a specific place, but rather as a new kind of service. And this is what Paris is excelling at building. The metro system is not quite. I mean, it is pretty radial. As long as you understand that the center is the entire middle half of Paris. Kind of like how I keep explaining to people that Berlin is a monocentric city. If the monocenter is a large blob, not the entire blob, but a large blob within the ring rather than one small place. Berlin has a very strong center. It's just that it's a bunch of strong centers on or near the Stadtbahn, as opposed to one small place like in an American CBD, and or like La Défense, but way more people work in the city than in La Défense, and and so in the city, there's mostly ever to ever service, except on the outermost margins, but I guess that's going to be tram. But in the suburbs, it's pretty radial, and this is not unique to Paris, because I believe this is the map that gets you. I believe that this is the map that is by operator. Yeah, this one. So note how you can't even trace the lines in and around city center. They're so dense. But in the suburbs, it's pretty clear which direction they all go in which direction is rather underserved. So adding more service would be, in the case of Paris, adding more circumferential service. I don't think any such line. Yeah, that's pretty close. So I don't think any such line is being planned in Tokyo. I think the thing in Tokyo. So because Tokyo is so overcrowded, the main things that they're planning on kind of not doing are relief lines, and these were not so in Paris, M15 is partly, it does double duty as a relief line because of the diagonal transfers at Les Halles for people from northern and southern suburbs toward La Défense. No such thing exists in Tokyo. In Tokyo, it's about city center. So they need more lines in city center, which is where it's most expensive to build, and Japanese construction costs are not high. They're pretty mid, but Japan is unwilling to build. It's a kind of austerity. They want to be able to privatize Tokyo Metro, and this means not lading it with debt from construction. So they are essentially just managing scarcity, and they shouldn't do that. They should build more. There are a bunch of cities that just need to be building a lot more than they are, even at present day costs, like Berlin and Tokyo are the main ones. There's cities that desperately need to get their costs under control, like the American ones, or London, or Toronto. But in Germany, the cost control problem is not that big, and in Japan, it's also not that big of a deal. I mean, these are not Korean costs, these are not Italian costs, these are not Spanish costs, these are not Turkish costs, but these are not American or British costs either. And so in Tokyo they don't need number 4, but they do desperately need, and I don't know to what extent there are significant gaps here, but they do need the capacity absolutely. The managing growth is not that much of a thing, because even though Tokyo is growing and is building a lot of housing, the coverage is so complete that it's all TOD, essentially. And the jobs stay in city center despite attempts to make the city more polycentric. And as a result, it's not like they absolutely need to build something to keep the city dense or something. That's just gonna happen naturally. So what else is there? There's straightening the network. So every large network is gonna accumulate some. Every large network is going to accumulate some defects. This means maybe lines that don't go where they should. This means lines that should have transfers and don't. New York has tens of places, if you count multiple times when it's both local and express, where two lines intersect without a transfer. So does Tokyo. These are the number 1 and 2 cities in the world in missed connections. I mean, they're also very large systems, but there are also very large systems that do not do that. London has very few such places. 8 by the most, I think it's 8, maybe 9 because of the new extension to Battersea. So the Battersea extension, speaking of London. So in London, the only recent expansion of the underground as opposed to Crossrail was a gap. It was a gap fill and growth management at the same time. So the underground is rather underbuilt in South London. There's much more commuter rail. The commuter rail had much better penetration than north of the Thames because this area was poor. It was easier to demolish housing. This is also true of East London. East London, because again it was poor, it was much easier to demolish buildings in order to get the railways right into central London, right into the city. So Fenchurch Street is right here in the city of London. Likewise, Liverpool Street is right here, and then West London is where you got things like Euston being by mid-Victorian standards on the moon. But separately, there's just not a lot of underground in South London, so there are gaps. South London is not especially poor anymore. Lots of growth demand. I mean, it's London, everywhere there's growth demand. And when they closed the Battersea power station and turned it into a brownfield redevelopment, so again, that's managing growth, but also filling in a gap. So they extended the northern line there. This was actually, so I started talking about straightening out the system. So they added a missed connection because they're so obsessed with capacity management that they did not want people transferring between the line and the Victoria line because the Victoria line gets overcrowded. So that's a bad thing that they did, but the good thing that they did is that they built this. They also used it to straighten out the system. So I'm talking about accumulation of craft like missed connections where you can try to maybe fix them by building a line that so maybe if it's two lines that are just a little bit too far from each other for the stations, that is, for a connection you can build a third line that intersects both, and maybe the platforms or the walkway. That's sometimes a thing. Or if you have a really dysfunctional branching structure, you can fix that. And this is London. So in the same way that New York is the worst city among the big ones, actually among all of them, in missed connections, and Tokyo is number 2. New York is the worst city in interlining and in reverse branching, and London is number 2. And I want to talk a bit more about reverse branching because I'm sure that you guys who watch regularly have heard me rant about this, but I think it's useful to mention in context, and I don't think I have a better map than this one. I mean, I guess there's the official map, but I dislike schematics, so let's do the real one. So in the Manhattan core, the lines, the trunk lines are colored. So trains on 8th Ave are blue, some are local, like the CNE, and some are expressed in the A. Red on this is Broadway and then 7th Avenue. Orange is on 6th. Yellow is Broadway here, 7th Avenue here and then Broadway. Green, this is Lux and this is Park. This is 42nd and then 41st. Magenta, that's just the 7 train. L's gray, that's 14th Street. Brown doesn't go into Midtown but goes into Lower Manhattan on Nassau Street and then goes all the way to south to Broad Street. And then Lime is the G train. It's Long Island City to downtown Brooklyn, and then with a tail, not going through Manhattan. And then the lines branch out, but then they recombine. And that makes planning really bad because too many things depend on too many other things. So on a system like this, you get to the point where you have multicolor sharing on outside trunks. So this is a 2-track line in 3 trunks, but the bridge is 2 tracks. So you have the M train and then the J and Z trains, and they share tracks. So things that happen on the JZ affect the M and vice versa. And then the M recombines into the local on 6th Avenue with the F. The F also shares with the G, so that's also affected. And then the F goes here and becomes the Express on Queens Boulevard. The M goes here, shares tracks with the E. Then the M becomes local on Queens Boulevard, and the E is Express. The Express is the local, so M, F, and E. So delays cascade. Timetabling always with how much fidgeting they're doing on the timetables. It's an impossible task to timetable the New York City subway accurately based on current demands of how much interlining there is and how much the planning paradigm expects frequency to vary by time of day. This is not an attack. This is very micro-targeted. So one of the things you could be doing with an extension is using it as an opportunity to reduce branching. They're trying to do that in DC with a separated blue line, and this is a good thing. That's straightening out the system. Unfortunately, they are not doing it completely, so they're not straightening out the part where the blue and the yellow line share tracks, which is a worse constraint, honestly, than blue, orange, silver. Where if it were just blue, orange, silver, and they didn't interface with the yellow as much, they would just shove trains on this 3-branch system, which is possible. It's a reverse branching, especially when the number of branches differs. It used to be 2 branches share a track at a time, and now it's 3, and that's where you can't run trains evenly. And if you don't run the trains evenly, then the crowding is uneven, and that leads to further delays, because when the train is very crowded, crowding does actually affect how long the train dwells at each station, and when it does that, then that makes the timetables less stable. Yeah, so the subway in New York does need to be de-interlined. But the point is that this can be done in conjunction with new construction. So actually, in New York, the opportunity to do that has arrived since the opening of 2nd Avenue subway, because previously there were more tracks in Midtown than feeding Midtown, going north and northeast. So right now, ignoring the numbered lines, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and only looking at the lettered lines, this is 4 tracks. They're not orange shirt with orange and blue with blue. It's mixed. So A, B, C, D, A and D run A, C, B, D. Here A and D run express short tracks. A, D. B and C are local short tracks. C, B I think turns here or then goes here, local rush hour. So 4 tracks, 2 tracks. Trains from Queen enter from the north, so 2 tracks, and then 2 tracks on the NW. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then in Midtown, it's also 6 tracks, because 4 tracks, 4 tracks, 4 tracks. But until 2nd Avenue subway opened, it was 10 tracks fitting into 12. So something had to give. So right now, the way that they would need to de-interline is express trains from Broadway go to 2nd Avenue, local trains go to Astoria. Whereas what they do right now is half the express trains go to 2nd Avenue, and then the other half and the locals go on Astoria, and that means that you have 3-line interlining through here, which is very gnarly. And likewise in London, the Northern Line has very extensive interlining. And so what they've done there is in London, they recognize that the interlining reduces capacity. So why is interlining bad? As I said, it creates delays because delays on each line cascade to the others. But the limiting factor for our capacity is in part reliability, because the interval between trains is based on uh, safety considerations, but the safety considerations have to have a margin of error. And the worse their margin of error, the more uh, uh, the more space you need to leave between trains. This is why computer driving, why automated driving creates more capacity. It means it's because computers are more precise than humans. And with that in mind, what happens is that in London, because they understand this, because maybe they can't build, but they're amazing at operations, the Northern Line, I'm actually going to find the London Underground map, even the schematic, because this is something that requires going over a map. So most of the so this section, so district, metropolitan, these are the subsurface lines and they're interlined to death, but the deep lines are mostly their own things. They share tracks with their own branches. The Piccadilly line has some track sharing on this branch here, but other than that, they're their own things. But for the North Line, its own thing. Note how this color somehow has two different trunks through the city, Bank and Charing Cross. And because Camden Town is not a cross-platform transfer, what they would like to do is set things up so that Edgware trains always go to Bank, and Mill Hill East and High Barnet trains always go to Charing Cross, but they can't do it until they upgrade the passageways between the platforms at Camden Town better, and that would make the trains more reliable and allow them to shove more trains at rush hour. But it used to also be the trains from both branches would go to Morden, and I guess this is how they're currently portrayed. But I believe what they've actually done is to permanently set things up so that normally all trains from Charing Cross go to Battersea. Also, you can see the missing transfer here, and that all trains from the Bank branch go to Morden to reduce dependency. So this is where you're using an expansion for other reasons to also straighten out your system. This is a good thing. A lot of again, big cities always have some kind of accumulated craft, something that seemed like a good idea at a time, or things that were even then criticized for being stupid. And and it's useful to use expansion as a way to often do it to sometimes it's soften the blow, because maybe you need to close some connection, maybe and you use the expansion to avoid actively hurting people. Maybe the expansion is because the physical infrastructure is so heavily based on the kind of accumulated craft that you need to do some infrastructure changes just to get around the craft. Like in New York, they needed Second Avenue subway for that. And in London, they needed they only have one branch in the south, so they needed to either have all of these trains loop around Kensington, which is not terribly efficient, or find another branch for them, which they did. So that is straighten out the system. Another, by the way, so straighten out the system can be done again to create transfers where there weren't before, to de-interline where needed, also to balance demand. So one thing that you might want to do is if you have a train that's overcrowded in one direction from city center but not in the other, you will want to expand in the other direction to match capacity. For example, the Victoria line is very overcrowded from South London. As I said, the underground is underbuilt in South London. So this is very crowded, and then it gets really crowded departing Victoria Station, because that's with the addition of all the commuter trains. Because the kind of job peak would be around Oxford Circus, not the Victoria. In contrast, there isn't that much here. I mean, people live here, but this is an area with very high train frequency because they're shoving as much as they can in order to provide some kind of relief from the south, but there isn't as much from the north. So the trains here are very good because the Victoria line is the most modern line, so it has the most it has the most modern infrastructure. I think it might even have air conditioning. I think it's the Vic and the subsurface lines that have air conditioning. The subsurface lines are the oldest, but there's space. The other tube lines that have such narrow tunnels, there's no space for the AC on the train, and there's no space for the air to go. So here you get nice trains, extremely frequent, very comfortable, and also not terribly crowded. So you might want to see if you can expand out of here, or probably more important, or probably better, build more housing here. Now this is not on the radar to expand this, but something that is on the radar to expand, the next tube expansion they're going to do is on the Bakerloo. So the Bakerloo used to be the most overcrowded line in London, because it was the only tube line for the northeast. The Met exists, but the Met is kind of trash because it has to share tracks with this. This is kind of the original Met, and then the Metropolitan main line is this, and meh. So the Bakerloo did this, and think this was also a branch of the Bakerloo. It was the most overcrowded line in London until in the 1970s built the Jubilee. This pre-existed, so they really built from here through city centre to Charing Cross. So this was not quite a straightening out the system, because the fact that the Bakerloo branch was not the problem. The problem was just it was overcrowded, so they built a relief line that's very close to it. You can see it on the schematic, but it can also be seen on a non-schematic. More cities would be London. You can see how... What? Why is it not working? But they're very but these are very close to each other, and then this was eventually expanded in the 90s at very high cost to create more. I don't think this was about capacity. This was about filling in a gap. The gap being that new things had been built since the 70s that did not have good tube connections to it. Canary Wharf, and then Stratford. So this was about new service to places that I do not know why this website is not working. But anyway, so right now the plan is to expand the Bakerloo going southeast, taking over. I do not know whether it will appear here. Taking over the Hayes line, which is a branch that I cannot find here, and I'm going to need to go to Google for it, to Google Earth for it. I think it's this one. No, it's maybe this one. Here. This is Hayes. So the idea is to take this branch, which is kind of orphaned based on the broader commuter rail network, and I think it gets its own track, and I think either from Lewisham or from Greenwich. Then there might be two options, they're uncertain. It gets a new tunnel that goes under this road and then hits and connects to the Bakerloo. So this is a line that's no longer at capacity, but just because they've provided so much extra stuff from the northwest. But then it rebalances demand by going in the other direction. Now, this is kind of weird because at this point, as I said, the Bakerloo is no longer especially crowded, and in contrast, the commuter trains in South London are rather crowded. So this would be some weird situation in which, because Tube is underbuilt in South London, you want to build more of it, connecting to existing lines that don't have any capacity problems from South London. Well, I mean, the Northern does and the Vic does, but not the Bakerloo, which barely goes into South London, only goes as far as Elfinland Castle. And so that's another way to straighten out the system. And okay, what happened was in my end, not at his end. So so what's going? So these are a bunch of things that you need to do when you're. Again, all of this is managing the city, because if you have a transit-oriented city, it needs this kind of planning. This probably it probably needs branching or a bunch of short terms. But I don't know if there are other branches that would be appropriate for this, because you do not want to introduce new reverse branching. In London, they understand how much it limits capacity, and how much it limits reliability. So they would like to avoid that in the future, wisely. This is a geographic map, not map. So the Bakerloo actually reverse branches with the Watford DC line. This is the Watford DC line. It's called the DC line because it was electrified first, so it was electrified differently from the other lines in London. It's actually pretty common for early electrification to have weird cruft, like you want to nowadays do high voltage catenary, but a lot of early electrification was third rail, like in Berlin, or the Watford. I actually don't know if the Watford DC line is third rail catenary, but it's DC. So Bakerloo goes here, and you can see how the Jubilee is very close to it throughout. This is on purpose. And there's a Jubilee line extension. And so you have these needs in cities like, the New York kind of class, London, even Berlin. And again, some cities do it better, some worse. All of these cities tend to be large enough that they have their own internal design processes, which is good because they have state capacity, but also often makes these places rather solipsistic and unwilling to look at outside experience unless it's modulated through consultants who are the exact opposite of state capacity. So this is so the idea is to go here and then take over this entire thing. And again, these are the needs in these larger cities. The point is that these transit networks already work, and the point is to grow them so they can work better. This also works with building more housing, which some of these cities do, like especially Tokyo, but also to a decent extent Paris. Not the city again, but the suburbs, the inner suburbs. London's not as good. Berlin is not as good. New York is downright awful. Canadian cities are actually very good at this. They build a lot of housing in Vancouver especially. And it's pretty TOD. The main complaint of Vancouver EMB is not quantity. I mean, to some extent quantity, but a lot of it is that they build in the wrong areas relative to demand. So they build near the train, but they build in less wealthy areas because wealthy areas claim that development will hurt their eyes or something. Yeah, maybe. I don't know about this. And I'm not going to talk about Vancouver more because it's not big enough. Again, in small cities, the issue is that you can't ever get enough lines to properly cover more than a small area. So development has to be spiky, which it absolutely is in Stockholm, but it is not at all in Berlin or Paris. And because you can't actually fully control your development, you're always going to get gaps. So a lot of the expansion is about how to manage the gaps. And so you want to, again, so you want to grow the system and make it better. And often these places have more missing ridership than less transit-oriented places. So I was talking before about how if LA were capable of building, which it really wants to be, but it isn't, it would build many more subway lines. And these subway lines would, I mean, the current ridership on the LA subway is crap. But this is a place where Metcalfe's law does actually apply. And if they could build a bunch more lines, and I did video about that, so watch that video, then they would get healthy ridership. But I still think that the missing ridership relative to existing ridership is high in LA. Maybe it's not as high in New York because New York has a much higher base of existing ridership, but per capita, New York might actually beat LA. In the sense of, yeah, LA could be more of a transit city, but New York could be a second Tokyo if it could build, because New York right now cannot build. But if it could, then again, this map, there's just so much stuff that could be built. Like you build more. So Second Avenue Subway Phase 2 is almost certainly happening, but you could do 125th. You could build to airports. You could do Nostrand, Utica, some outer extensions. IBX, it's the line that follows this line. It's easier to see on Google because it's a visible cache. It's this one. You could extend it to the Bronx. You could build more trunk lines. You can build a lot more trunk lines. You can build a lot more commuter rail tunnels, and not just the one that they finally funded, the Hudson Tunnel project. So this is a 2-track line. It's the busiest commuter railway in North America by a margin. So they're turning it from double to quadruple by building. I shouldn't say quadruple because it's not going to be very closely parallel. It's going to be something like this, but same difference. They could build this. They could build not just this, but many more such things, and more people would ride the trains because it would be a lot more convenient. And if New York could build it Parisian coast, then yeah, Paris is adding 200 kilometers. New York is a bigger city. New York could be adding that or even more. Yeah, they could do that. They could do a bunch of that, and then New York could actually be a Tokyo. So New York actually is probably missing more ridership per capita than any other place in the United States, which is kind of insane because New York by far has the highest ridership per capita already. But it also means that there's so much demand for more, especially if you include housing growth. Just because, San Francisco has a lot of such demand, Washington, Boston, but New York is just so much more transit oriented, and there's already so much stuff going on there that they could be so much more. Again, this is a city that has, on pre-corona numbers, about 2 billion rail riders a year. I'm not usually counting buses because I'm trying to count the entire trip, and across modes, certainly across operators, they're always unlinked, and I want them linked. Unlinked being transfers are double or triple counted. Linked means they're not. And usually the way I approximate it is that I just count rail trips, because in New York, subway trips are counted linked because of the turnstiles. I mean, the system does not actually know how many times you've changed. It can infer, but it can't know. And if you're doing local to express changes, then it just cannot even properly infer unless it does surveys. And the buses are almost entirely feeders. The commuter trains do have some connection to the subway, but not even that many. Quite a lot of commuter rail ridership walks from Penn Station or especially Grand Central. So, so in New York, it's about, on pre-corona numbers, 2 billion trips. Metro areas, depending on how you count, either 20 or 23 million. So somewhere between 90 and 100 per capita. Berlin is 240. And yeah, this counts Ubuntu S-Bahn transfers, which does exist, but it's not that much of an end of the world. It decreases the numbers by a little bit, not by half. Tokyo multi-counts to hell because it multi-counts whenever people change between agencies or between private operators. Even on the same train, if the same train is operated by, let's say, Toei, and then if it's operated by Toei and then it's operated by Keisei and you're right on the same physical train, you are counted as two trips if you cross boundaries. Then in Tokyo, again, with this horrific multi-counting, there are about 400-ish per metro capita. And yeah, it's less if you count properly, but it's not 100, it's maybe 200 and something properly counted. New York is, again, 100. In New York, you have so much more. So this is why it's important to talk about even places that are not that much of a proportion of their respective countries. Most Americans don't live in New York. Most French people don't live in Paris. Most Brits don't live in London. And I apologize, Borders, for saying Brits, but let's face it, lol public transport in Scotland. Like, yeah, it exists, but Glasgow is not much of a transit city, neither is Edinburgh. And so this is why it's important to get this right. Now, in New York and London, what they need is to get their construction costs under control, and the same is true of Toronto, which wants to build a relief line. They really want to build, they just can't. So every time they do another study and they realize it's too expensive, and a politician says, "I will intervene," and because the politicians are stupid, they make things worse. And then lather and repeat. And this is something that needs to be done right. Again, there are something that a lot of cities do. And again, the Paris system is not perfect. Paris does need to be building a little bit more into the city and not just around it. And M18 is just a garbage project. But they need to expand. But they do need to build more. Again, in Paris they are building more. I don't complain about quantity in Paris. I complain about quantity where I live in Berlin, where they don't build very much. And they need to understand that this is important. Like at the level of advocacy, I think there's this issue where advocates are people with atypical propensity to take mass transit. So part of it is that the advocates often live in places with good transit. So in the United States, a lot of urbanist advocacy and a lot of transit advocacy is in New York. But that usually gets filtered into like New York specific things. And the thing is, yeah, transit advocates in New York are more likely to be riding the train than a non-transit advocate in New York. But a non-transit advocate in New York, in Metro New York, still has a 1 in 3 chance of taking the train to work. And in a place like Cleveland, it's more like 1 in 50. The upshot is that even though US-wide, again, about 40% of transit commuters live in or around New York, and another 25-ish% live in the secondary transit cities. In advocacy, it's different. In advocacy, yeah, there's a disproportionate urbanness to it, but it's a lot less than 40%, and I think also less than 25%. And there's a lot more people in LA and a lot more people in like Angie Schmidt in Cleveland, for example, and they keep talking about how they need their own resources, and suddenly the national conversation focuses on places where there's, for all intents and purposes, no public transit. So the San Jose's, the Cleveland's, the Minneapolis's, and then people talk about those regions, I think, disproportionately to how much ridership they can possibly get. Can Cleveland rebuild itself to have public transit? Yeah, it can, especially if I think it would have to come from high-speed rail to Chicago and New York, creating some kind of core that they build around. But that's still possible. The issue is that they're still not going to get anywhere like the numbers that New York could be getting, even to the exclusion of present-day New York ridership. Again, New York is 30%, Paris is 43%. Unless you're telling me that a Cleveland could go from like 2 to 15, New York has more suppressed ridership per capita than Cleveland. New York could do a lot better than 43, just as Paris can do better than 43. New York should be looking at 50, 60. This is why this matters. And again, it's mostly about how to do it. There are a lot of different reasons to build there. Lines, like a lot of lines are gimmies. Now you don't like it. You shouldn't like it when there are gimme lines in your city, because if there's a gimme, it means it has not been built for some reason that is banned. In Berlin, that would be Märkisches Viertel. The reason it has not been built is that transit advocates in Berlin don't give a shit about low-income housing projects that are that far outside city center. And what you want is to build lines. Again, if there's a gimme, you just build that. But to build lines that are maybe, let's call them near gimmies, because in a healthy environment there should not be gimmies. And yeah, this is how you do this construction. And again, this is really important. This is like my main set of points to make. So if people have questions, I will answer, and if not, we can adjourn. Let me stare at something that's in night mode because the computer day mode. It doesn't hurt my eyes because it's still light outside, but the computer day mode is so bright that it literally hurts my eyes when it's in the night. So let's be night mode. And let's reload the player just because I want to see how much lag I have. We're now 18 seconds? Yeah, I can live with 18 seconds. Okay, it doesn't look like there are questions. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you on Saturday. When I'm going to talk about what I already know, when I'm going to tell you what I'm going to talk about, talking about queer urbanism. So thank you, and ciao, ciao.